is a future here for those who dare.
Welcome back, Andor fans, to part 2 of me analyzing why Andor Season 2 is the best on-screen Star Wars content since Return of the Jedi. I am still in shock of just how great this season and Andor as a whole managed to be. And considering we likely aren't going to get anything good from this godforsaken company for at least a decade, I'm taking all the time I need for myself to explore this season in depth properly. Because it absolutely deserves it. Back in part 1, I had a look at the first episode, and so today, we'll be continuing on by taking a look at episode 2, Sagrona Tima. If you are just joining me for episode 2, then welcome. And so for any of you that are new or aware, you should know going into this that I think that the first arc of the season gets a little more hate than it deserves. The first 3 episodes are most definitely the weakest stretch of the season and have a lot of issues. However, there is also a plethora of good that can be found here, and most certainly should be highlighted. Before we dive straight in, however, let's do a brief recap of where we are heading into episode 2. So Cassian escaped with the TIE Avenger and made his way to the Forest Planet, which hasn't been revealed to be Yavin 4 yet. The plan went awry, and he is now being held hostage by a group of constantly yelling rebel buffoons. On Chandrila, the wedding events have begun. Luthen has come without Mon knowing he was going to be here, and although he says he's officially here for Skolden, Mon senses that there's other reasons as to why he is here. And Tay seems to be noticeably on edge, which leads us to believe that something is off with him. On Mina Rao, Bix, Willman, and Brasso have made a new home for themselves, but the arrival of the Empire threatens to upend that peace and quiet. And finally, the Empire has set in motion their hostile plans for their Calcite extraction on Gorman. So, now that we all know where we are, let us begin, shall we? We pick up back on the Forest Planet. At the end of episode 1, the rebels began to shoot on each other and have split off into 2 groups. One in the crashed rebel ship and the other in the TIE Avenger, and are now in a state of trench warfare. The fact that it has come to this just further highlights the fact of just how unorganized and untrustworthy each of them are. Andor was ragdolled by Gertis's group with them into the rebel ship and is now tied up in there. So Barty and Gertis's group each send out a member of their faction to crawl out into no man's land, searching for a fallen comrade. They both discover that the body has been chewed to pieces, which frightens them back both to their respective camps. Now I think this little 2-minute stretch here is mostly unnecessary and should have been cut down. It mostly serves to reveal the fact that there are scary beasts out in the wilderness that could come and eat them at any time if they aren't careful, but that could have easily been established with a simple roar or some type of other animal noise from beyond the trees. I'm fine with the episode starting off by showing the current status of each of their respective factions. That's fine, in fact, that's what I'd expect. But this whole middle stretch of this opening scene doesn't really add anything that couldn't have been added in a mere 2 seconds. It also feels a little redundant considering that one of the rebels stated to Andor last episode that there were, in fact, beasts out in the forest. So really, this all just serves as a visual reminder of something that we already had the information to. Andor states that they should start concerning themselves with gathering up water, signaling the fact that they're going to be here in this status for a while. Cut to Coruscant. Dedra and Partagaz walk outside towards the ISB headquarters. Dedra stops in place and tells Partagaz that she doesn't want the Gorman project. Now, Dedra is not keen on taking up the Gorman project as a responsibility, because it would distract her to the point where she wouldn't be able to continue her search for Axis. Although that's where her heart feels like it belongs. That has been her sole mission in life over the past year and some change, so she absolutely does not want to be taken away from that. It has pretty much become her identity within the ISB at this point. A strong desire which will come back to bite her in the end. So a nice little bit of foreshadowing here. Partagaz also pokes at the fact that she really hasn't delivered anything substantial as it relates to Axis. They haven't found Luthen himself, anybody important in his network. She's kind of at a dead end, which again foreshadows really nicely how that desperation to find Axis and prove herself is going to come back and bite her later in the season. I also found it pretty apparent too that Partagaz is also trying to stress the importance to Dedra of getting this right. The Ferrix incident was a disaster, and also at this point in the timeline, rebel activity is really starting to ramp up. So Partagaz is trying to paint the picture of, we need results. We need this to go right. We do not want to be on the Emperor's bad side, especially in these times. Partagaz is insistent to Dedra that Gorman is in fact a gift, but you can tell on Dedra's face that she doesn't see it as such. Some really great performances here. We know full well where the two of their headspaces are, in particular Dedra. which will carry across the whole season. She doesn't want to run the Gorman Project, but has to, because of the chain of command, and by the time we reach the later episodes, you can tell that this is something that Dedra wishes she did not have to involve herself with. Moving on, we cut over to Chandrila. Luthen and Clea escort the statue for Skolden as it's being brought into the building. The two wait for the room to mostly clear itself before they can quietly talk business. A little nitpick here, but I found it a little out of character that Luthen and Clea would talk out in the open like this. Yes, they are talking quietly, but you never know who's intently listening. They probably should have taken some more caution here by speaking in code or something, if they really needed to talk business right here and now. So Clea tells Luthen that she hasn't heard anything from Cassian, and is unable to get through to Bix on Mina Rao because of Imperial inspection. She's stressed out, saying that she needs real comms. This once again highlights the fact that Clea never really should have been here. There wasn't really much reason for her to be here. She needs to be at her comms, especially since Cassian has been dispatched on a really important mission. She can't, or at least shouldn't, broadcast from Chandrila because it's an Imperial planet, which risks exposing themselves if the broadcast is intercepted. Luthen then finally insists that she should leave, and Clea says that she found a ride, before we cut over to Perrin and Mon. Perrin and Mon have a rather light conversation at first, until Perrin spices it up by talking shit about Tay in front of Mon. Apparently, last night after Mon left Tay proceeded to get wasted and had to be ushered home. Oh shit. Yeah, something's off with Tay. If the alarm bells weren't going off before, then they're certainly going off now. Mon has a reserved look of worry on her face, and I think it's now that we really start to get the sense that something big is going to go down with Tay. At this point, we don't know what that is yet, but clearly at this point the show is steering in the direction of some big event. If you've seen the show, then you obviously know what happens, but I think that it's good that the show gradually builds up to that event, rather than it just happening out of the blue because Luthen just happened to unleash his fury. I think Mon and Tay have 4 or 5 conversations throughout these 3 episodes, and sure, maybe 1 or 2 of them could have been cut or condensed, but I think it's more important to highlight the fact that the show did an excellent job of building up that tension, to the point where Luthen could no longer ignore it. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's move on. Cut to Mina Rao. Bix, Wilman, and Brasso are working when they are interrupted by Kellen, who has come to give them an update on the Imperial situation. The Empire is making their way through all the zones, and they may very well be coming this way soon. It becomes evident pretty quickly that the 3 of them are in a pretty sticky situation. They don't have a lot of options. If they try to run or avoid them and get caught, then they're gonna die. If they stay put, however, and the Imperials ask where they came from and take a hard look at their IDs or whatever they have in the Star Wars universe, then they're also screwed. Their only real option is to hope that the Empire doesn't take a hard look, because they know that they need the grain. Although that's a risky bet, which it seems they are going to have to take. There is nothing much else that happens here besides the plot unfolding. We don't get any character development or new character beats or insights, so I don't have much to say about this part. If you remember back to part 1, that was my biggest complaint about the Mina Rao section as a whole. The surface level plot is interesting, but nothing much deeper beyond that plot really changes our characters in any way, besides Bix. This brief section really highlights just that. The information that's revealed is interesting, but there's not much substance. No, I'm not saying that every single scene has to teach us something new about the characters or their mindsets or whatever it may be, but if you start stacking scene upon scene upon scene where it's just strictly plot, it starts to turn more into a case of this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and so on and so forth. Back on the Force planet, we are still in a status of trench-like warfare. However, things have started to calm down. The issue of food is starting to become a real concern on both sides, since food has been a hard thing to come by ever since they have been stranded here. That's really all there is to this brief scene. Both sides want food. Their desperation is starting to become more and more apparent, and now it's just a matter of time seemingly before one side breaks. Cassian also suggests to Gertis that they should establish a perimeter around the TIE Avenger, and considering that it's super foggy, that's a pretty good idea if your goal is to eliminate the other side. It isn't going to be foggy forever, so the chance to take advantage of that fog will eventually fade. We then cut over to our first scene of Cyril, who I am excited to see. He was one of the most interesting and well-developed characters of Season 1, so I'm super intrigued to see where his story is going to go now. In the endless room of bureaucracy, Cyril has managed to work his way up to the floor manager, it seems, in just a year's time. I'm not surprised by that in the slightest, considering how almost psychotically Cyril is devoted to his ideals of maintaining order, that he'd be recognized quickly for his commitment and get promoted. Funny enough, he gives the the same speech to this kid that he received when he first arrived at the Bureau of Standards himself. It's like poetry.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
During which he discovered a massive deception of corrupt purchasing agents stealing Imperial supplies in 4 sectors. I actually laughed a little bit when he was saying all this. Not because it's intentionally funny, but just the fact that Cyril is so incredibly passionate about his mundane bureaucracy job in the pursuit of maintaining order across the galaxy was just slightly comedic because it fits his character so perfectly. It's a great reintroduction scene for him. There is one thing that I'll say about Cyril as regards to his character this season that I think I'll mention now so we all have it in our heads, is the complete absence of Cassian Andor from his character this season is a little odd. That was such a strong motivation, the motivation in fact for everything that he did in Season 1. He wanted to find and eliminate Cassian Andor. And yes, I know that a year has passed, we don't know for sure what happened in that time, but the fact that Andor isn't still heavily on his mind I think was a little bit of an oversight by the writers. And by the time we reach the confrontation between the two later down the line in Episode 8, although it's a great scene, I don't think it quite reaches the emotional payoff that the writers were hoping for, because it entirely relies on story elements from the previous season, nothing that was set up or developed during Season 2. Moving on, we're back on Mina Rao. There's some really good acting going on throughout this scene. Bix, Brasso, Talia, and Kellen, you can tell, are all scared shitless, but are doing their best to act calm under pressure. With just a couple of transport ships and a handful of soldiers, the Empire is able to strike fear into everyone as they move around. Kellen greets the incoming Imperials, engaging in small talk as they make their way around inside. I think it's worth noting that even though he's being friendly and they're being non-hostile in return, he's still trying to extract information from them in a clever way, asking them where they're headed next as to maybe warn others about their future movement paths. It's a nice little detail that adds a little bit of character to Kellen. A character like him in this story would be very easy to forget, but the show has done a nice job of establishing him as a clever man who's able to get information. We see that here as well as back in Episode 1. He must have gotten that information by some means, so on a second watch I can now infer that it was his clever nature that was able to get him that information. Over in storage, Bix is working on something, I can't quite tell what it is, but she's approached by Lieutenant Kroll, who we immediately get the sense is a slimy Imperial bastard. If you want to think of the Empire like a full-on insect invasion that just continues to spread across the galaxy, Kroll is like a gnat, a fly that just won't go away and is quite annoying. And he's making Bix obviously uncomfortable. She's doing her best to just remain calm and friendly without saying something that could set off any alarm bells in his head. Kroll makes his way to saying things that show his obvious sexual interest in Bix. And with his status as an Imperial lieutenant, and Bix as an illegal immigrant on Mina Rao, she is not in a good situation. Before Kroll is able to make any advances on her though, Brasso interrupts the conversation as a means of seemingly saving her. Kroll gets the sense that he'll have to try again another time, and leaves with a sly smile on his face. As the scene unfolded, it became very clear to me that this was not going to be a one-off incident. Kroll was definitely going to be returning at some point. And with Cassian off-world, this adds a nice bit of stakes to Bix's current situation, cause she's somehow going to have to find a means of getting out of this tricky predicament that she finds herself in. Cut back to Chandrila. The families have begun taking a hike up the mountains as part of a ritualistic wedding hike that is a historical custom on Chandrila. We get some nice views of the Chandrilan mountainous terrains. There's some wonderful costume design here as well, although it doesn't add much in the grand scheme of things. You could have cut most of it if you really wanted to, and it wouldn't have had much of an effect. Although it's only like 30 seconds long, so I'm fine with it being in here. It's some nice world building for Chandrila, regardless if it may not be essential. The only real thing of note that happens here though is we get a brief look into the headspace of Vel, which is nice to see since it's been a while at this point since the show has taken a real time to focus on her. Vel is currently very much struggling on the inside that she has been separated from Cinta for a very long time. Luthen knows where she is, but won't tell her. Probably for the means of security. That would probably be Luthen's response. There's an exchange of ideas here which I think is really important to Vel's eventual character journey towards being anti-Luthen by the time we see her in Arc 3. The excuse that Vel and Cinta likewise have told themselves is that the work must come first. There is work to be done. Their feelings towards each other are secondary to the more pressing matter, which is defeating the Empire. Mon responds to that, however, by basically implying that, yeah, the work is important for sure, but if you aren't living your life at all and you're just a slave to the work entirely, then that isn't good for you either. We are people after all, not machines. Now, whether you agree or disagree with what Mon is trying to say, I think that puts a little idea in Vel's head that starts to blossom over the course of the next year, and is slowly going to turn Vel away from Luthen, because by the time we reach Arc 3, she has split off from Luthen and has now joined the Rebel force on Yavin 4, and is very much against him for separating Cinta and her for all that time. On a second viewing through, I've pinpointed this as the kind of inciting incident, or moment you could call it, that eventually spirals itself into Vel breaking off from Luthen. That thought that Mon put in her head was likely there for a year, and then when Cinta tragically dies in episode 6, she becomes more confident in her resentment towards Luthen for separating the two of them for so long. They were never able to have the time they wanted together because of Luthen. So with all that said, it's a nice little seed that the show plants here that shouldn't go unnoticed. Back on the forest planet, we are still in a status of trench warfare. Nobody has made a move yet, but Barty is the first one to take action. His group have tied up the TIE Avenger with ropes and are hoping to turn it around enough as to where the guns will be facing towards the downed transport where Gertus's group is hiding in, and blow them all to hell. So if the lack of food was going to lead to this stalemate eventually ending, then this is going to further speed up that process. Because once Barty's group has that TIE Avenger turned around, and Gertus's group is still in that transport, then they're cooked. So while I was watching this, I was thinking to myself, okay, yes, moving that TIE Avenger is possible, but is all this really necessary? All you need to do is just very carefully move through the fog and flank the other team when they're caught off guard. Yes, you'll probably take some casualties, but you're likely to win as well. Either of the groups could do this. Now maybe Gertus and Barty don't want to do that because they don't want to have any casualties due to their deep care for the people in their respective factions. But I don't think that's the case. It's never been implied to be the case. Literally 30 seconds ago, Gertus didn't give a fuck that Plug was potentially taken hostage. So I don't understand why either of the sides haven't tried this yet. Cut over to Coruscant, and we find ourselves in Dedra's personal apartment. Seeing Dedra with her hair down and listening to operatic music was a little jarring since we've never seen that side of Dedra before. But seeing this more relaxed, or at least seemingly relaxed, version of her is quite interesting to me. Not very often do we see any Imperials while they're off duty. So I commend the show for taking a risk and showing this more commonplace side of her life. In walks Cyril, and the show has now confirmed that the two are in fact a couple, which is something that the show was very much leading towards in my opinion back in season 1. It was just a matter of time of when they were going to get there. But seeing it pop up so suddenly like this is like, whoa, oh shit. I guess they're together. This is going to be quite an intriguing dynamic. So as Cyril walks in, he wasn't expecting Dedra to be home this fast from her trip. Cyril has gotten grocery items for a dinner that the two of them will be hosting tomorrow, but Cyril suggests that they should just pretend that she hasn't gotten back from her trip yet. Dedra very intensely says that they can't cancel again, and Cyril is visibly nervous, which makes you think, what kind of dinner and with who would make Cyril so nervous? Oh, wait. I think I know. Cut back to Chandrila. The second night of festivities have begun. Mon makes her way across the room to seek out Tay. She pulls him aside to speak with him, and Luthen watches on from the shadows with a very, almost beastly look on his face. Tay decides to come out and make his feelings plain. He's pissed off. He feels undervalued. He's helped Mon smooth over her financial troubles. Skolden got what he came for. He helped Mon start the Foundation. All the while, he's taken massive financial risks and he's gotten nothing in return. When Mon is shocked by this, he replies by saying that he thought his feelings were obvious. Now, this is an instance where it would have been nice to see the development of this current situation unfold over the past year. The last time we saw Mon and Tay, they were in very good standing with each other. But obviously, in that past year off screen, Tay's feelings towards Mon and the whole situation have soured. As he puts it, he feels undervalued. We've had to skip to the point where we are now because we didn't have a chance to see any of the in-between stuff. So it does feel a little sudden how this is all playing itself out. Tay doesn't even realize it, but he's sinking his own ship. He's making himself really dangerous by the words he chooses to speak. He could single-handedly fuck everything up for Mon if he so chooses. He's pissed that he's got nothing in return for taking on the massive financial risks that he has. And when he says that, ironically, the rebellion and rebel activity, the things that he's been helping fund, are the reason for all of his financial situations going sour, that's the nail in the coffin for him. He has a motive now to want to see them fail, therefore he has to die. There's no other way. I think Mon even knows it too, just based off her facial expression in this scene. She's horrified by that thought, or at least that's the way I read it on the second go around. Maybe she hasn't gotten to the point yet where she thinks he needs to die, but he most certainly has to be dealt with in some way, shape, or form. Luthen watches on, and you can just tell that the same thoughts are going through his head as well. Cut back to Mina Rao, and we get a quick little update as to what's going on there now. Kellen says that he successfully chatted up one of the soldiers earlier, and was able to get some information out of him. He thinks that they are headed to the 0300 block next. This once again helps further characterize that Kellen is quite a clever individual. He's able to masquerade himself as a friendly individual to extract small but very valuable information. The soldiers may not think of it as that important of information, but it absolutely is, for all the other block's current circumstances, so they can properly prepare for what's to come to the best of their ability. Now, I do wish that this exchange was shown. I think it would have been better to show this character development for Kellen rather than just imply it. I know it's not essential to the story, so I can understand why it wasn't included, but considering that this was one of the shorter episodes in length, I think you could have snuck it in there. That's all we get from here for now, so moving on. Cut over to Coruscant. Kalea has returned from Chandrila to hopefully make contact with Cassian. However, the show cuts away before anything substantive can happen, so this brief scene merely serves as an update on Kalea's status. Back on Chandrila, we get quite a beefy scene. The patrons on Chandrila have gathered for a giant feast, and right before Perrin makes his big speech, Luthen is off to the side speaking with Mon, grilling her intensely to figure out what's going on with Tay. So Tay wants a number for going through all the trouble that he has gone through. Presumably that number is referring to credits. Luthen just wants to know, okay, how much does he want? But Mon doesn't know for sure. They didn't get into any specific details while they were speaking, and this is setting off major alarm bells for Luthen. He knows that the longer they let this simmer, the more likely it is to all go awry. I think by this point, Luthen already had it in his head that he needed to kill this man, although he hasn't said it yet. But Mon is trying to calm him down by saying, we'll find a number, okay? We'll find a number. Which is basically her way of saying, don't do anything drastic, please. You can tell Luthen is not satisfied with that. It's way too open-ended. And before they can say anything more, Mon is pulled away to listen to Perrin's speech. I love how there's such stress about really important shit going on in the shadows of this otherwise very lighthearted and happy event. It's a nice juxtaposition there, which I think is worth pointing out. Perrin very gleefully makes his way to the center of the room to make his speech. It is his ritualistic tradition to offer one piece of advice to the soon-to-be man and wife. And the advice that he chooses to give pretty much reflects Perrin's philosophy, his mode of operation as a person. He's not super invested in all the horrible things and sadness ridden throughout the galaxy. He's much more interested in tuning all that out and focusing on the happy things. The parties, the laughter, all that good stuff. And that's the advice that he gives to Lita and Stekken. And it's interesting looking at Mon's reaction. She clearly respects and understands what he's saying, with a subtle smile on her face, but ultimately, she is almost the opposite of Perrin. She's not so concerned about the parties and the more trivial things like he is. She cares about addressing the evil written throughout the galaxy. She cares about tackling the corruption and the broken and twisted system that is the Empire head on. She's not just going to tune it out. They're not quite polar opposites of each other, but certainly are close to what I would consider to be foils of each other. Foils that have a respect for each other and care about each other. Cut back to the Forest Planet. Our newest update on the Rebels is that they are still unmoved and remain in a status of trench warfare. Barty and Gertis have a shouting match across no man's land, culminating in Gertis offering a challenge to Barty. Seemingly this challenge will end this all so they can move on. Alright, thank God, it finally seems like we're starting to get somewhere. The two groups meet in the middle and drop their weapons. They decide to settle their feud by playing a game of Star Wars rock, paper, scissors. Okay. This is kind of a hard subject which I don't have a strong opinion on. As you'll all know, Star Wars has always had versions of games that resemble games that we have here on Earth, that are changed to fit a more Star Wars aesthetic. The obvious examples of this are Dejarik, which is just Star Wars chess, and Sabacc, which is just Star Wars poker. The game that they are playing here is called Five Hands, which is just the Star Wars version of rock, paper, scissors. Now this one out of the three that I've mentioned is the one that I am not very keen on. Although Dejarik and Sabacc are clearly inspired by chess and poker, they feel completely alien to me, and very much fit that galaxy far, far away aesthetic. But for me, I don't know how I feel about Five Hands, mainly because I don't know if it quite passes the line of feeling like it's from a galaxy far, far away without feeling too similar to the point where you might see something like that here on Earth. I'm not exactly sure what that line is. On the first go around, I didn't like that it was just rock, paper, scissors pretty much, with different symbols. However, on the second time through, I didn't mind it as much. It's to each their own, I guess, whether or not you think this took you out of the experience. Let me know in the comments, because I'm interested to hear what you guys thought about it. Anyways, while the group is playing Five Hands out in no man's land, Cassian is being guarded by one of the rebels that was left behind to guard him. While he's not looking and paying attention to the game out in the distance, Cassian quietly removes a gun that was hiding in one of the drawers. He sneakily is able to get this guy to surrender and tie him up without anyone noticing out in the distance. Now I understand why he has had to wait for this moment to do this, because it hasn't been till now that the vast majority of them have been away from the ship. But the fact that a gun just happened to be there so perfectly, so this could happen, did feel a little too contrived for my liking. And I think that mostly has to do with the fact that it wasn't foreshadowed at all. If they had given us a couple of shots earlier in the episode to let us know that the gun was there, but Cassian was the only one on the ship that realized it, then that probably would have been a convenience that I could accept. Regardless, however, I'm so ready for Cassian to get out of this storyline so he can get back to the actually important plot. So if they felt like they had to write a contrivance to get him out of here, then go ahead, I guess. Cassian is able to maneuver his way through the surrounding tree line, and with the help of the beasts that have been teased over the past 2 episodes, they come to distract the rest of the group. He's able to make his way to the TIE Avenger, and escapes before the rest of the rebels are able to stop him. The last thing we see is Cassian fly off into the stars, past the tower that we all recognize. So now, we for sure know that this planet is in fact Yavin 4. And that's it for episode 2. So overall, how does episode 2 stack up when you look at it in its entirety? Well, compared to episode 1, I think it improves in some areas while also retaining many of the same issues that were present in episode 1. The Imperial plotline gets the least amount of time this episode, but the stuff that we do get is high quality. It sets in motion a lot of things for Dedra, not just the fact that she'll be leading the Gorman project, but also the fact that because of that, she will no longer be able to focus on Axis, something that's going to tear her apart inside and ultimately lead to her downfall. We also get to see the first glimpses of Dedra and Cyril's relationship, and the very odd dynamic between the two. However, not much of substance happens between them until episode 3. The Mina Rao plotline is fine, however it still holds a lot of the same issues that I had with it from episode 1. That being that it mostly feels like story beats are just unfolding, without taking time to add much substance to it. There are a couple of seeds laid which are going to be important later, such as Lieutenant Kroll's perverse personality, as well as the Imperial military moving around from block to block. However, this is all mostly just set up for the big explosion to the storyline that we'll see in episode 3. There's nothing wrong with that. The setup obviously needs to happen. However, the setup is most certainly brief and not very substantive. The Yavin storyline, similar to episode 1, is just not that interesting or engaging. In fact, the Yavin section for this episode I think is worse than episode 1, largely due to the majority of it being a stalemate. Now the fact that they're in a stalemate isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, this would be the prime opportunity to develop some of the new characters. But the show doesn't take the time to develop any of these smaller characters in any significant way, which makes me struggle to care about what's going on. The Chandrila plotline I think is the clear winner for the best of the episode. It's tense due to the development of information being presented that has a large amount of stakes for the rebellion at large. This triangle of interest of sorts between Luthen, Tay, with Mon in the middle is really gripping stuff. The twist of Tay being much more self-interested than we initially thought adds a nice deal of tension to the episode and makes you excited to see how it's all going to play out come episode 3. There's also a nice little bit of setup for Vel's eventual turn against Luthen down the line. Even though it's brief, it helps the payoff of Cinta's eventual death in episode 6. Since we know that they've been separated for a really long time, and their reunification was so short-lived before Cinta tragically died. I'm going to give episode 2, similar to episode 1, a 6 out of 10, above average. I wanted to give it a little bit of a higher score, and initially I thought I was going to, but upon rewatch I do think that the painstakingly redundant and non-substantive elements of the Yavin plotline do hold it back from being what I'd consider to be an overall improvement on episode 1, despite all the other sections being average to great. And with that, that's going to do it for my thoughts on episode 2, bringing part 2 to an end. If you've made it this far, then I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to listen to some of my thoughts. If you did enjoy it, then please consider leaving a like and hitting that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this. It absolutely helps out the channel a lot. And as always, I'll be interested to hear what you guys have to say. Let me know down in the comments your guys' thoughts on episode 2. Do you think it was good? Bad? An improvement on episode 1, or vice versa? Do you think that the first arc of Andor season 2 is too overhated? Let me know what you guys think down below. But anyways, that's going to do it for today. Stay tuned for part 3, where I will be covering episode 3. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next one.